I'm joined by COSATU's parliamentary spokesperson, Matthew Parks. Thank you so much, Mr. Parks, for joining me this evening. I think let's first start with, what do you make of this news?
Good evening. Thank you for having us. I think for us it's positive news. We had welcomed, Portia when she was appointed a few years ago. We had hoped we would see a significant turnaround at Transnet, given that it's one of our most important economic assets, especially from a freight and logistics point of view, for the mining, the manufacturing, agricultural sectors. But look, the fact is, on a macro scale, she's not been able to make that indent. Transnet today is processing, transporting less goods than it was 29 years ago. And yes, indeed, we can't, lay all the responsibility on her doorstep, because, as you said, Transnet is recovering from a decade of state capture and corruption, many years of neglect in terms of investment and so forth. But the fact is, it has not made the progress we needed to have made. We're not moving fast enough in terms of rebuilding Transnet, and has a huge impact upon workers. The mining industry is potentially going to lose about 35,000 jobs in the near future. Several mining companies have already begun the retrenchment notice process, putting thousands of workers' jobs at risk at the mining companies itself, but also in the value chain and in the communities. The state right now is experiencing a huge revenue crisis, which means that the state is now having to cut corners left, right, and center to keep public services. And this is directly because of Transnet. Because if Transnet is not fully operational, the mining industry cannot get its goods through our ports in time. Thus puts the economy in a huge crisis. So I think for us, we welcome it, but we need to see now beyond this, what is government and Transnet going to do? We need to appoint new management quickly, management that is competent, that can turn things around. But it also means we must give support from government side to Transnet. So Treasury must give support around reducing wasteful expenditure and so forth, dealing with the endemic corruption. The law enforcement institutions too need to assist on the corruption front, and also assist Transnet to secure its railway line from cable theft, which is really crippling it. We hope to see government giving more support to Transnet in terms of recapitalization, bring on board additional funds to invest in infrastructure and so forth, because we don't do this thing, even if you bring on board new competent management, we're not going to move Transnet to the level it needs to be moved. And we really don't have the luxury of time. We need to see movement in the next few weeks, the next few months.
Now, of course, we know that, Ms. Darby has been come under a lot of fire recently, especially. We know that the Minerals Council South Africa, of course, being one of those bodies, as you said, the mining industry as well. But now, I think the big question is who is going to take over and who's going to fill this massive role. We see now at Eskom as well, we still don't have somebody to take over from under a director. So how quickly do you think are we going to get a new Group CEO at Transnet, and who to take over this very important role? Like you also said, Ms. Darby can't be the only one responsible for all of those stocks. She also took over in 2020, a very crucial time for Transnet. But who now to take over, and how quickly should this happen?
I think it's going to happen in a matter of weeks. I think Ms. Darby said that she will remain at Transnet until the end of October. So there is some space for a bit of a handover, I guess, to an acting Group CEO, as well as a CFO. We really don't have the luxury of time. We hope to see government advertising this post by next week, to be honest. There's no need to delay beyond that. They need to already put in place by next week. Hopefully an announcement can be made about who would act in the meantime, because it will take more than a single month to appoint somebody. But they need to do it aggressively. We should really finish Christmas this year with a permanent Group CEO. Also, a new CFO has also resigned. We think, though, that there's a need to replace even a Transnet freight rail, the management, because that really is at the heart of the crisis at Transnet and the economy. And really, to be honest with you, the management of Transnet freight rail has not done justice. It's not only us who've been raising this issue as COSATU for some time. We know our affiliates, SATAW in the transport sector, NUM, the mining sector, and the energy sector, have been raising alarm bells. The Minerals Council too has been raising alarm bells. We really think there has to be drastic action quickly. But again, you can appoint new competent people, but if you don't give them the support from financing to corruption to procurement, etc., it's not going to be enough. But there has to be consequences and there has to be accountability. Some of the mistakes at Transnet are beyond amateurish. The fact that we had a decline 2 weeks ago because they hadn't put in place sufficient battery in the locomotives. You ask why? It's because they're waiting for those locomotives to arrive from overseas. So there needs to be a sense of urgency and a sense of accountability and just a sense of common sense at Transnet if we're going to turn things around. Yeah. We can see some kind of bit of a shift in Eskom, so we need to see a similar shift at Transnet if we're going to move the economy.
And it is going to take more than just one person to do that. It is a mammoth task, of course. We know there's the debt issues as well. Eskom has its own debt problems, but we know Transnet definitely has its own debt. If I'm not mistaken, it's over 130 billion rand in debt. But, apart from that, I think when we take a look at, somebody to blame and a head must roll at the end of the day, it isn't just going to be one person that will be responsible, to turn things around at Transnet. What are those problems, would you say, that is actually the root of all causes of most of Transnet's problems at the moment?
Yeah. Look, there's a multiplicity of serious crises, existential crises, to be honest. Yes, we have the decade of state capture, and I think it's estimated that the state capture and corruption cost Transnet about 50 billion rand. We think it's still ongoing. If you look at the most recent Sunday Times last week, about, I think, another 50 million rand ghost trains. You just can't make up this kind of stuff. You have the problem of the crisis with the Chinese railway corporation not being willing to provide critical parts to Transnet for maintenance and repairs. And I think there's also some outstanding locomotives as well. We've seen a real cancer, an endemic crisis of cable theft, where powerful syndicates are literally stripping our passenger and our commercial railway networks to the bone for cable theft. So there needs to be a very sophisticated, smart kind of partnership between Transnet, the police, the intelligence authorities, the NPA and the court, but even to rope on board the private security companies too, because this crisis is so huge that the state alone can't resolve it. There has been some initial kind of positive cooperation between Transnet, the law enforcement, and the private security along the Richards Bay coal lines. But we have to get things moving. The fact that you have the locomotives moving at half the capacity that they moved 20 years ago, 30 years ago, points us to a huge, huge crisis, and that we don't have the luxury of space or time to get things moving. So I hope there can be a real decisive partnership going too. There also is a need to invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure has been neglected quite seriously for many, many years. And of course, you're not going to remain competitive or efficient if you're neglecting the infrastructure. There's a need to rapidly invest in new machinery, for example, the cranes, which have not been invested in for quite some time at the different ports. And of course, the skills of the employees to operate these as well.
Exactly. So the list continues. I'm sure you would have mentioned a lot more other things that also need to be fixed there in order for things to be turned around. And it's a much more deep-rooted problem that we can be talking whole evening about. But I do want to talk about, I think you mentioned, is it over 35,000 mine workers that could potentially now lose their jobs? One of the many issues there at Transnet, so or generally in the industry. So what would you say are the main factors for that, and what's the possibility that that could actually happen?
It's a very scary possibility. It could happen in the next few months. If you don't get Transnet moving by December, then we're in real trouble. It's going to see these workers being retrenched, families plunge into absolute poverty. It can potentially create ghost towns. Already, Glencore has already begun a Section 189 process at one of its mines in Mpumalanga, Siriji as well. Initial reports indicate there could be about 35,000 mining jobs at risk. That's almost 10% of the mining industry. We know the mining industry is very prone to retrenchments, and when they retrench, it's in big numbers because you have huge concentrations of labor at these different mines. But the economic fact right now is that the mining industry is not able to get its coal exports onto trains and through our ports to their destinations. So we're not only missing on a commodity boom for the second time, we might see these mining companies simply not being able to mine anymore because they've got a backlog of exports. They can't mine anymore if they can't get the goods through the ports. Mining industry also suffering significant losses because now they're having to ship the goods on trucks at a much higher price to get them to the ports. You've got queues of about 7 kilometers long at Richards Bay Port for these coal trucks. It's much more efficient and effective to transport coal on trains as opposed to trucks for obvious reasons. There's a huge damage to our roads as well. If you look at some of the roads from mines to the ports, they're being destroyed because of these heavy trucks. If you look at some of them from Sishen and so forth to Richards Bay and so on, it's huge devastations. That puts a risk to commuters. It creates additional traffic congestion and so forth. We should also bear in mind the mining industry is really the backbone of the economy. It's our industrial backbone. It's a huge contributor of revenue to the state through companies tax. It's a huge earner of foreign exchange for the economy as well. So the mining industry struggles, and the rest of the economy is going to limp along. We simply can't afford it. when mining industries tend to retrench, they tend not to re-employ those workers later. They tend then to move to automation. And again, our mining industry,
I'm sorry, Matthew, of course, we only have, limited time. I just want to ask you very lastly as well, because you mentioned now all of those issues, and that's when I'll bring this last question in here. Then what do you think of, Transnet Freight Rail CEO, Sizakele Mzimela? She should probably be held responsible for, some of these issues as well. She, of course, remains in her post.
No, without a doubt, she has to be held accountable. It can't be just simply that the group CEO, Derby, goes and that the Transnet Freight Rail CEO is allowed to remain. The heart of the crisis today, right now, is at Transnet Freight Rail. And there needs to be a sense of accountability. She is the CEO of Transnet Freight Rail, and she needs to be held accountable. She's been there for about 3 years now. Things have deteriorated. They've not gotten better. They've gotten worse. There's a real consequence to workers. We don't think the workers should be ones to sacrifice their jobs for management, which gets paid a fortune, not a small salary, but a fortune, is allowed to get away with it. There has to be accountability for to turn things around. In the private sector, if CEOs fail, their heads roll. And likewise, in our SOEs, if they fail, there needs to be a consequence and action. They can't continue to go as is, and workers are the ones to pay the price, both in the public and the private sector.
All right, thank you so much. COSATU's parliamentary spokesperson, Mr. Matthew Parks, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Of course, if you haven't heard yet, it is Group CEO Portia Derby of Transnet, of course, and the CFO, Nonkululeko Dlamini, who resigned today.